Hi, my name is Dr. Ramona Marchand with Trauma Informed LA. I have been in public service for over 20 years. I'm a licensed clinical social worker who specializes in working in the areas of trauma, social justice, child welfare, and equity. This training is going to be for trauma-informed lawyering. So I'll start with a quote. Of all the things trauma takes away from us, the worst is our willingness or even our ability to be vulnerable. And there's a reclaiming that has to happen by Brene Brown, Rising Strong. So today's training, we're going to cover an overview of understanding trauma. We're going to go into a little bit about what that looks like within the legal world for trauma-informed lawyering. And then we're going to go over some of the basics of trauma-informed care and how to incorporate that into your practice. So objectives for this training is going to be, again, to provide an overview of trauma and to improve the knowledge of the impact of trauma on the attorney-client relationship, and to provide you with some tools to recognize and manage trauma with clients. So let's go over the basic overview of trauma. So trauma at its basic level is an event or experience that threatens death, leaving the person involved feeling intense fear, helplessness. They can become very overwhelmed, with these type of experiences, and they can be either direct or indirect. So with direct trauma, that happens to the actual person themselves, right? So they can be involved as a victim. This could be if they've been a part of a disaster, such as Katrina or 9/11. It can even be what's very commonly known as post-traumatic stress disorder, as you see a lot of veterans come back from war, or just even the experience of being in war-torn countries, like right now with the Middle East. You can have a lot of people who are experiencing that type of trauma. So the threat, if they think, that their life is in danger, that could be very overwhelming. Indirect, if you see people who are experiencing these deep types of trauma, but if you witness a crime, if you're in a community where there's a lot of murders or things like that, that could be just as significant as the person experiencing the trauma. Within our line of work, we may have a lot of clients who have experienced abuse of their family members, of their friends, and seen it. And that could be just as traumatic, again, as the direct abuse or of the trauma. So with complex trauma, this can be when you have multiple events, and it can be over a wide range of time, and it has really long-term effects. So you can go from like having adverse childhood experiences, what we refer to as ACEs. This could be that over a lifetime you've experiencing some type of community trauma. This could be looking at the intersections of trauma as it results to race. It could result to gender identity. It could result to sexual identity, and the oppression and microaggressions that people experience can all be related to trauma. It could either cause trauma, but also trigger past trauma as well. And so it could keep people in a trauma state for longer periods of time. And we have to remember that those who live in marginalized communities often experience trauma every day. And that's often what we see when we interact with our clients. So it may be mistaken for anger or depression or them being uncooperative, but really it's just a manifestation of their trauma. So transgenerational trauma can be historical trauma transmitted across generations and within communities. And in a little bit, I'll show you a video that's going to touch upon epigenetics and how trauma can live within the body and can be passed through our generations. So all of the clients you will have experienced one type of trauma, and many will experience multiple types of trauma. So think about the effects of behavior on your representation of a client. If you're seeing a client show up with these behaviors, are we first quick to judge? Are we understanding the type of trauma that we're dealing with when we're dealing with our clients? And maybe there's types of trauma that you can't see or you don't know about necessarily, that the client isn't going to disclose. So think about what types of trauma that they may be, and jot those down, and let me know if there's any unique types of trauma that the clients could be experiencing that we haven't talked about. So I'm just going to touch upon this briefly because we're going to have a separate training to discuss this. But I'm going to talk about secondary trauma. So when you're working with clients who have experienced these different types of trauma, whether it be a single event or complex trauma, and most of our clients are going to have experienced complex trauma. And these are like layers on top of each other of different experiences. So you can have community violence, you can have adverse childhood experiences, you can have, a victimization if they were a victim of a crime. Particularly if you're talking about multiple traumas for people who experience sexual violence or domestic violence, or any kind of interpartner violence. And again, coupled with, oppression, racism within communities, that can also be very, very impactful within their, behavior and also their mindset. So for us, as practitioners, vicarious trauma or secondary trauma is when we're working with these clients. It's kind of like that emotional residue. It's spilling over to us. We're listening to it. We're reading reports. We're seeing photographs of victims. And that could be very overwhelming for us as well. So we have to be aware of that. And again, I'm going to go into a little bit more about what that looks like and how we deal with it. Another thing to look at would be compassion stress. So this is the stress that's produced from wanting to help a trauma survivor. And we want to help everybody. And we want to be successful with whatever outcomes that we are trying to get for them. Unfortunately, we're not going to be successful with every single case and every single client, but we get this stress like, oh my gosh, look what's happening. And I can't save this client. And this is what I was tasked to do. And then over time, this long period of time where you're compounding all this compassion stress, it can cause compassion fatigue. And you just become, that's very debilitating. And it's like you're in this state of exhaustion, dysfunction. It can have biological, physiological, emotional impact on your life, both professional and personally. And you really need to be able to recognize some of the signs that lead to that. And we'll talk about that again and about self-care practices and another training. But I just wanted to highlight that here because it's important to know that when we're talking about trauma, we have to look within the trauma in ourselves as well. So to better understand the impact of stress and trauma on the brain, we're going to go over the basic functions of the brain. And I'm going to use a little thing called a hand diagram. So it's a handy way to remember the parts of the brain. So you have your brain stem, your limbic system, and your prefrontal cortex. And these areas of the brain are the primary areas that really address how trauma impacts us on a neurobiological level. So your brain stem is going to be the bottom part of your wrist in the hand model. And really, we know it's at the back of our heads, right? So this controls your breathing, balance, temperature, digestion. And these processes are automatic and they occur outside our conscious awareness. So, we don't even know what's going on with that because it's just automatic. And then if you take your thumb and you go like this, that's going to be your limbic system. And this includes the two main parts that really operate with your trauma network inside your brain. And that's the amygdala, which sets off that flight, freeze response, and then your hippocampus, which really encodes our memories of our experiences. So oftentimes when we have clients who are very startled, that's their amygdala going off. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. And then you have your hippocampus, which really stores your memory. So when you're impacted by trauma, a lot of times you'll have clients with memory gaps, and you'll think, well, how come you don't remember? Because that's the impact of trauma on the brain, right? So when danger is perceived, the brain goes into, flight, fight, freeze mode, and then it impacts and takes over even what the hippocampus is able to do with storing memory. So a lot of times you'll have clients who have suppressed trauma memories and really it's very difficult for them to be able to access it and remember because their brain is protecting them, from those experiences. So just to kind of give you a comparison of what that may look like for us, think about, I don't know, everyone has fears about something, right? But let's say you see this big, scary looking spider, let's say a tarantula, right? And it's coming towards you and right? You jump, or you see a bee flying towards you. That is your amygdala saying, oh my gosh, run, danger, danger, right? Even if you see a car speeding up, so, rationally we think, okay, really, it's not really going to hurt us. And we know that, most tarantulas are not poisonous. And so you start to think and rationalize that, okay, I'm really safe. The car is speeding, but I'm not really near the car. But if you've experienced trauma, sometimes those perceptions of trauma or threat to yourself can really take over and impact, how you react. And then, it's constant. So what you may see in some clients, you may see them, just talking about their trauma, increased sweating, they get the release of the endorphins, and their perception and awareness are decreased or changed, as I said, because the amygdala is taking over as a survival mechanism. So now your prefrontal cortex, that's going to be your fingers. So now you have the whole brain right here. That regulates our executive functions like judgment, decision-making, impulse control, comprehension, information processing, logic, decision-making, many other functions that involve rational thinking. And so oftentimes, again, this is what we see when we're talking to our clients. You think their inability to be able to make decisions, maybe you think they're lacking logic, or when they're making just decisions, and they're having issues with impulse control. All those things have to do with the processing within our brain. And so our prefrontal cortex is kind of blocked off when we're dealing with the amygdala. The amygdala kind of takes over again with that flight, freeze response. So all of these parts of the brain work together, and it's an excellent stress management system when it's working right? But our brains are designed to adapt to the environments that we're in order to keep us safe. So a lot of times clients will dissociate just so they can feel safe and they're not experiencing in the trauma. And sometimes it's hard for them to be able to pull themselves back in an area where they can feel safe. So as practitioners, it's our job to create that kind of sense of safety and an environment of safety for them to feel safe enough to be able to share their trauma stories with us. Because again, when we're unsafe, the survival part of the brain, the amygdala, will take over. So as I said, stress affects two crucial areas of the brain, the hippocampus and the amygdala. And these regions are linked to our ability to learn, to process, again, short and long-term memories. And the hippocampus is responsible for our factual memories. So again, sometimes clients will tell you a story, but you may have the actual report and know that that is not exactly what happened. But because of trauma and the effect on the brain, sometimes that's what it's doing. So it's impacting our ability to really understand the story as we know it to have happened. And we really believe those stories, particularly for those people who've experienced trauma. And the amygdala is also responsible for our emotional responses. So later on, we'll have a case vignette of an individual who's crying, uncontrollably. But under stress, when you're thinking about telling your story and telling it over and over again, you can have these emotional responses because your body is taking over, due to the trauma that it has experienced. So when that happens, your hippocampus is weakened. So again, your memories aren't going to be the way they are supposed to be. And then your amygdala is always going to take over again for survival purposes. So again, when it lights up, the amygdala, it's taking over. And unfortunately, it's kind of what we call flipping our lid, right? So the amygdala is going to take over, and it's constantly thinking that you're in this threatened state. And when that happens, you're always on high alert. You can't really think clearly. You can't make decisions clearly, and then you're triggered for simple things. As I said before, you may see something that is a fly flying your way, but in your mind, oh my gosh, I'm afraid of bees. So, you're jumpy, or even a loud noise. So a lot of clients will get startled if they hear like a loud noise, even someone who's closing a door and it accidentally slams by mistake, and they may jump, because all those startle responses is the impact on the amygdala constantly being activated in that trauma state. So we know that intended, it's supposed to be able to provide this healthy and adaptive response to tell us, hey, you're in danger. But if you're constantly being triggered in a trauma state, then it can really impact our learning, our relationships, our memories, and connecting to other parts of the brain. And there's the cortex. I forgot to lift that up, you guys, but there you go. So now we're going to talk a little bit about adverse childhood experiences. And I touched a little bit about it earlier today, but this is something that can happen between infancy to adulthood, and it creates, a lifetime of issues. You can have addictions, you can have transgenerational trauma with abuse, It can cause people to have mental health issues. And so I'm going to share a brief video with you to kind of explain what this looks like, explain how trauma impacts, children who grow up obviously to be adults, and our clients, and how epigenetics plays a part in that, and how trauma is transferred through our bodies.
A child's experiences early in life are important building blocks for the
Sorry,
key to
guys.
healthy development. But children's brains capture other experiences as well, stressful events. However, not all stress is bad. Positive stress involves normal childhood experiences, like starting daycare or meeting a new person for the first time. This stress is essential for healthy development because it helps children develop coping skills and confidence. But when stress is frequent, chronic, and uncontrolled, it is toxic to children, especially when they do not have a caregiver to provide support or buffer the stress. Adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, such as abuse, neglect, exposure to intimate partner violence, parental depression or addiction, and poverty, are toxic stressors which could lead to lifelong changes in learning and behavior. ACEs early in development can impact social, emotional, and cognitive functioning, increased risk-taking behavior such as drinking and substance use, and increased risk of disease, disability, and social problems later in life. The question is, how do adverse childhood experiences impact a lifelong development? One of the most important systems in our body is our stress system. It's activated when we experience stress. We become alert, our heart rate increases, and so do our stress hormone levels, cortisol and adrenaline. Our body is ready to react, what is known as fight or flight. A short period of time after the stress is over, or if a child receives support from a caregiver, the stress response turns off and the body returns to a normal state. Adverse childhood experiences create stress responses that stay active, and without the support of a caregiver, the system has difficulty shutting off completely. This constant and prolonged activation can affect immune system functioning and increase the chances of sickness, infection, and disease. Prolonged activation of stress hormones is also toxic to the brain. Certain areas of the brain are more vulnerable to toxic stress, including the executive center or the brain's control center, an area important for solving complex problems, attention, reasoning, impulsivity, inhibition, and learning. A second area is the emotional center, the brain's alarm system, which is involved in processing and interpreting emotions and the ability to control impulses. The third area is the memory and learning center, the brain's filing cabinet, which plays a major role in learning and the formation and retrieval of memories. Science shows that adverse childhood experiences impact all of these brain centers. Behaviorally, what we begin to see is emotional distress, poor emotion regulation, greater impulsivity, learning difficulties, and physical and mental health problems. More recently, science has begun to look at how ACEs cause changes in gene expression through a process called epigenetics, which helps us understand how nature and nurture interact. Epigenetics causes changes in the way genes work without changing the DNA code itself. This occurs through chemical changes influencing how the code is used. In other words, genes are like the hardware in a computer. They determine the boundaries of what is possible. However, we need an operating system to tell the hardware what to do. Epigenetics is like the operating system directing the function of a gene's DNA hardware. The genes we are born with are the genes that we have for life, but experiences like nutrition, exercise, smoking, stressors, and relationships all affect our biology. Adverse childhood experiences are associated with epigenetic changes related to stress, brain development, cognition, and systems associated with mental and physical health. Changes that happen early in brain development are more likely to be enduring and are possibly passed on to future generations as well. The good news is that positive, supportive relationships at any stage in life can make a difference. However, supporting families and children early on will help prevent many of these negative outcomes. One of the key ingredients for healthy development is having warm, loving, and actively engaged caregivers. This involves promoting serve and return interactions, where caregivers actively and warmly engage with the child, making eye contact, responding to sounds, words, gestures, emotional needs, and sharing experiences like reading and play. Providing programs that support caregivers to strengthen these abilities are the blocks that build healthy foundations for life.
Okay, so a little bit about the ACEs study. So what it looked at is that if a person experienced, most people will experience at least one ACE, but as we go up the chain and people experience up to 4 ACEs, then that could have a really huge impact on their biology, their reactions, their behaviors. All those are very significant. So what the people who designed the ACE study looked at. So the ACE study originally was done in Oakland, and it was mostly done, surprisingly, to white, middle, upper class participants, and it focused on participants in areas within the home. It looked at, again, with abuse and neglect. Did you have a parent, who was formerly incarcerated? It looked at some of the things that would be what we consider adverse experiences in the community, but they looked at it and they said, what, we really need to look at a more diverse population. We need to look at, an urban area and figure out a more socioeconomic diverse area. And so they did another study in Philadelphia and they looked at community level adversity. So one of the things they looked at was people who witnessed violence. So we talked about that a little bit more in regards to even complex trauma and what that can do. So it asked, have you ever seen anyone or heard anyone who's been beaten up? Common in urban communities, if they've been stabbed or shot in real life, those things actually do occur quite often within the legal sense, or even in the world of social work. That's what we see within social justice and legal professions. We see clients that have experienced this now, particularly now in society, or we see people who feel that they've been discriminated against. And I talked a little bit about marginalized communities and how that impacts them. So the ACEs study also recognized study also have a huge impact on how they are discriminated against or treated badly because of race or ethnicity. In addition, community violence, I talked about that earlier, but adverse neighborhood experiences, and if they felt safe, within their neighborhood. It also impacts that sense of trust, that sense of safety that we're trying to create when we're communicating and engaging our clients. But if they're experiencing these type of things, it's going to impact how we engage them and how they show up and interact with us. And we have to keep in mind that if they experience these type of things, that it may change that relationship or change that engagement. If they've ever been bullied or lived in foster care, a lot of former foster youth are become, victims of the justice system and also interact with many other systems. A lot of our former foster youth become homeless. They become involved in the justice system at very high rates. So what they noticed when they did this study is that when they had people with maybe 1, 2 ACEs, and they noticed people were more likely to have adverse experiences later on in life, if they had 4 or more, 40% of the individuals within urban areas had 4 or more of these expanded community ACEs, in addition to having the ACEs from the original study. So that just goes to show you that when you're interacting with clients, we need to be aware of all of the impact of the types of trauma that they can experience. So we really need to shift the narrative for our clients, right? And so a lot of times when we're talking to our clients, we ask the question, oh my gosh, or we think, right, what's wrong with them? You know, they're coming in, they're so high strung, they're not really being cooperative, they don't remember anything. And those thoughts may go through our head, but we have to remember their story is critical to really understanding what happened. So we have to say, what happened to you? What is your story? And let me help you to understand that. And again, the symptoms that we see are all manifestations or adaptations to traumatic events. Remember what I told you about the amygdala adapting to your environment to keep you safe? So those things are defense mechanisms that are helping the client. So how do we help them? So healing happens in relationships. And so a little bit later on, I'm going to talk about the power of empathy and how we can create that. And I'm going to show you another little short video on what that looks like. But just remember that every interaction you have with the client is an opportunity to help them towards that path of healing and restoration and resiliency. So we talked about this a little bit in the earlier slides, but I'm just going to touch upon it just a little bit more. When we see our clients with these behaviors, we want to approach their behavior with openness, with curiosity, and again, thinking, what happened to them? You know, that this is how they're presenting to us, you know, and again, you're going to see clients that maybe don't remember their incidents of their victimization exactly as it occurred. You may see clients show up with anger, depression. Sometimes they're detached or they disassociate. You may be in the middle of an interview and then they seem like they're not even paying attention to you. But that, again, it's very overwhelming to discuss and talk about trauma. So those could be what you're seeing. Maybe you have a client who's engaging in some risky health behaviors, promiscuity, things like that. Those are all manifestations of the trauma. And I did talk already about them being distracted or disconnected. And remember, their story is critical to helping and understanding them. So it's important that you do that. Sometimes if you have clients who experience any kind of sexual trauma, you could see some avoidance behavior in these clients. Maybe they have a lack of eye contact. They have a lack of willingness to respond, you know, to your questions, and that could be mistaken for resistance, but really it's not. It's, again, just a manifestation of the trauma. You can also have clients that appear to not care about the outcome. So you're talking to them about different types of legal outcomes or legal remedies, and they seem kind of like nonchalant about it, like, I don't care, I don't care. But really, they do care. They're just saying they don't care because, again, that's their anxiety, or just they're constantly not winning in life. You know, they're constantly being traumatized and having more complex trauma. So they're overwhelmed. And that's one of the things that they'll do. They'll just kind of like be like, oh, I don't care. But really, we need to look underneath what we're seeing on the surface and go underneath. Think about those behaviors as an iceberg, the tip of the iceberg. And when you go underneath the iceberg, all this type of trauma in their story, really, and what happened to them is there. So having that trauma-informed strategy and really understanding those behaviors could be that are present, or could be impacting this collaborative, cooperative relationship that we're trying to build with our client so that it can have better legal outcomes. So trauma-informed lawyering, how does this all impact you? So actually, the California Bar states that a lawyer shall provide competent representation to a client, and that's in Rule 1.1. This requires the legal knowledge, skill, and thoroughness and preparation reasonably necessary for representation. So as an attorney, if you're representing clients who you reasonably suspect to have a trauma history, it's incumbent upon you to learn how to manage this in the context of this attorney-client relationship and know how it will impact that relationship. So with trauma-informed care, it started within the mental health and medical profession. So in the context of the legal profession, it really helps us to reframe what success of helping clients is, and to understand the legal process of connecting them to resources that will help process their trauma. So we know that as lawyers, you guys aren't therapists, but your interactions with clients are therapeutic. And understanding and interacting with them in a trauma-informed way will help to achieve greater or better legal outcomes for your clients, because you'll be able to build more trust and rapport with them and get more information from them that's going to help their cases, right? So trauma-informed care aligns itself with these overarching principles and practices that understand trauma as a defining life event, and it really shapes the survivor's sense of self and their sense of others. So when they're interacting with you and you see these behaviors, you're seeing them again, their coping mechanisms. And our goal really is to empower and help our clients recover as service providers with these populations. So the service relationship, again, should always be collaborative and client-centered. It's important to connect clients with resources that can help them process trauma and understand, again, that their brain is prioritizing the trauma and not necessarily the legal advice that you're giving them, because it could be overwhelming for them to process. So here's a little video I told you guys I'm going to show you. See if this will work.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah, and we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
All right. Okay. So you saw Brene, and you saw how she said, it's very hard and difficult for us to be able to respond to our clients. So we think about those things, and you may find yourself, think about the times that you said at least, or really minimized a person's experience. And that's very, very risky to do, particularly with trauma survivors when you're helping them as a service provider. I know sometimes we want to look at the positive with our clients, but unfortunately, when we're doing that, it could really cause issues, for the client. So, you want to make sure that these silver linings or these areas of hope that you're trying to provide to them aren't impacting, again, that relationship. So when you're looking at trauma-informed strategies, you ultimately seek, again, to do no harm. So that's the number one rule as a social worker or doing anything with the trauma-informed philosophy. Our goal is to really resist re-traumatization. I'm going to talk about that later in regards to the 4 R's. I won't get into them now, but trauma is a safety issue, and we want to really be able to reduce these unsafe situations, for and behaviors for our clients, and increase thoughts of safety. And how can we create those safe spaces, these brave spaces, for clients, particularly when we're having these uncomfortable, courageous conversations and really trying to get into the core of some of the things that have happened to them. So you want to focus on this, again, client-centered safety mindset, with the client so that we can create these zones of safety and a path towards healing for them. So a lot of the research indicates that when people are given tools and stuff to deal with their trauma, then that really helps them. So again, it's not your job to be able to be these therapists and think about, oh, what do I have to do? I'm here, I have a case and I have to do this. But our job, again, your competence rule indicates that you need to be able to look at, what can I provide my client? I may not be able to do that, but can, me as a practitioner provide the resources my client needs? Can I connect them to things that are going to help them navigate what they're doing and process the trauma that they have? So again, research says if they're given tools to cope with the trauma, that their lives will improve in short time frames. And again, we're looking at the outcomes of the cases we're trying to give to our clients and provide them with those tools. So for SAMHSA, their concept of trauma-informed care goes over these 3 E's, and it talks about events, experience, and effect. And we touched upon these earlier in the training. So when people are exposed to traumatic or stressful events, and how they think about how that experience greatly influences the long-term adverse effects of them carrying the weight of that trauma. And these effects, as we showed you earlier, can really affect their neurobiological makeup. It could affect their social and emotional makeup. They can have difficulties coping, feelings of having trust, managing their cognitive processes, and really being able to regulate those behaviors. So if anything else, when you're done, you should remember that, these events, experience, and effects is the 3 E's, and we're going to talk next about the 4 R's. So looking at, again, the trauma-informed approach that SAMHSA put together, they have these 4 R's, and they're realize, recognize, respond, and resist. These are good to keep in mind when you're interacting with clients, and just so that, you can have them on a little postcard or, somewhere near you, write them down inside your little notebook so that you'll say, okay, I really do need to realize that what I'm seeing right now may be a client that's experienced a lot of trauma. So just to understand that how that can affect people's path to recovery, and to recognize the signs that you're seeing in the client, the memory gaps, the disassociation, the resistance, maybe sometimes the nonchalant attitude. All those are symptoms of or manifestations of their trauma. And then responding. Remember I said about connecting them to resources. So responding to trauma by integrating knowledge about trauma into your policies, your procedures, your practices is very important. So if you can connect clients to things that are going to help them process their trauma, or even in a way that what you're doing, your practice itself, and connecting clients in a trauma-informed way is part of responding to trauma. In just the ways that they're interviewed, the way that you engage them, the setting that you're interviewing them in, all these things will connect. And of course, as I said before, the number one rule is do no harm. So we want to resist any re-traumatization. We want to keep in mind that the client is the pilot of the plane. They really need to be able to guide, where the relationship goes and how we can collaborate with them to jointly come up with outcomes or plans that are going to help their cases in the future. So keep in mind that as we have clients to come into our spaces, that a lot of the spaces are not trauma, designed with that healing mindset and in mind when it was built, right? So a lot of times we go into offices or buildings that aren't trauma informed, and maybe the colors on the walls are very loud, like red, or something that's really bright, and that could be a trigger for a lot of clients. A lot of clients, if you go into settings like a rape crisis center, if you have an opportunity to go into one of those centers and ask them for a tour, particularly as practitioners or working with people with trauma, sometimes there won't be any sharp corners. It'll be a round room so that the clients can see everything around in the room at the same time. There aren't any hidden doors or anything like that. Sometimes you'll have rooms that are glass all the way around so clients can see out and they don't feel trapped. It really just depends on what their trauma is and what their trauma triggers are. We also have to keep in mind that every person that they speak to within your agency, they need to be trauma informed because they're coming in and it's unfamiliar. It's an unfamiliar setting, it's unfamiliar people, and they're having to retell their trauma story over and over again. And that's not necessarily what we want to do when we're being trauma informed. So we want to minimize the number of times that the client is sharing details about their story. So again, we want to make sure that when you're trauma informed, the client is leading the process. And, we have the ability to be able to step back, and not from a legal strategy standpoint, but to let the client talk about what they're looking for in legal services, to educate them, so that they become and feel more empowered as they go through this process. And we really, again, do not want to perpetuate any more harm or trauma on the client. So there's going to be situations in the justice process in particular that aren't trauma informed, and we can't control every single one of those processes. You could have situations where people are denying the client's story is true. It's important to be transparent about this, and is your position as a provider. So you want to be able to advocate on behalf of your client and protect them from harm. But at the same time, transparency is one of the tenets of trauma-informed care. And you want to make sure that clients know and that you prepare them for these situations, particularly if they're testifying and you're thinking about how is opposing counsel going to interact with my client? How is the courtroom going to trigger my client? If they have, and we'll talk a little bit about this when we talk about trauma-informed interviewing, but if you have a client who's exhibiting stress responses and maybe they start scratching their skin or they're itchy or they're pulling their ears or things like that, and that they do that from your interactions with them, then you want to be able to kind of address that perhaps in your testimony or you're addressing the court so that it doesn't become a distraction, or that they make assumptions or judgments on your client. So you can ask them something like, tell me about how you react when you're stressed out. And then they can say, well, I'm doing it right now. And then they know, that the judge or the jury or the court knows, the officers know that that may be something as a manifestation of their trauma. And then that's our job to be able to, again, advocate and educate others that are going to be interacting with the clients that may not be as trauma informed as the agency we're working for. So again, we talked about what re-traumatization looks like, and I'm just going to briefly talk about a couple of these. Not being seen or heard, if their trust is violated, if it's not a collaborative relationship, if they're being treated as a number. Now that's a big one when it comes to both, the legal system, criminal justice system, the child welfare system, just social justice systems in general. Clients come in and it's like, okay, next. It's like, we can't do that, when it comes to clients when we're dealing with that, if we're being trauma informed, because it's going to impact, again, how they show up, and how they show up, again, that's just a manifestation of their trauma. I know I keep saying that, but I really want you to walk away with understanding that every behavior that you see has a story behind it, and really understanding the story of what happened to the client is critical to be able to have, positive legal outcomes for them, because it'll help you, again, to dig down to really what happened to them. So you want to give them opportunities to be collaborative and give them choices, in their legal process and what remedies that they have when you're presenting things to them. So the 6 principles for trauma-informed care, again, are safety. We talked a lot about safety. We talked about trustworthiness and transparency. Again, you need to build trust and be very transparent about every part of the process. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about transparency in interviewing. You want to prepare the client and tell them everything that you're going to ask them and why you're asking them the things you are. If you're able also to connect them to some kind of peer support, other groups that may be for people, because a lot of times clients think this is only happening to me. Like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this happened to me. What did I do? And so when they talk to other people and they say, oh, wow, you've experienced what I've experienced. And it's not that it's a normal experience, because no victimization of a survivor is normal, but they can see and align themselves with other people who maybe have been able to successfully navigate the trauma that they experience. And then there's some hope there. And not that at least, but definitely they can see that, oh, I see that somebody else is able to navigate this, and it makes them a little bit more stronger, more empowered to be able to do that. And again, we talked about collaboration, empowerment, voice and choice, and definitely resiliency. So together, these key principles create a workplace environment that respects people's experiences and manages incidents of re-traumatization. So remember, resist, re-traumatizing and triggering the clients. Okay, so within that spectrum, again, you want to ensure physical and emotional safety. We talked a little bit about this. We talked about choice and collaboration and prioritizing and providing that atmosphere that allows, victims and survivors to feel validated, and really affirming each and every, contact that they have at your agency. You want to affirm their story. You want to affirm that you understand their trauma and provide that respectful, professional care and boundaries with your client. That's very, very important. So with the intervention for being trauma informed, you again, I keep saying the same thing, but it reinforces it. You provide that safe base. You understand the behaviors or manifestations of their trauma. You're connecting them to resources, and you're collaborating with your clients. So now we're going to go over a short case study, and I'm going to read it out loud for those who may be just listening in. So it says, you're engaging a client after the initial intake interview, and the client asks what legal issue, you ask the client what legal issue brought them into the clinic. The client begins to break down crying, explains that they recently discovered their partner of over 20 years has been sexually abusing their children since they were young, and now the kids are 12 and 15. The client explains the relationship was also abusive. So they were a victim of inter-partner violence, but they were unaware that their children were being abused. So the client explains through tears that they're undocumented and scared because of their protective order expired last week. And they disclose that they're receiving threatening messages from their partner and can't think of how to protect their family. So let's pause and take a moment and think about, what behaviors do you observe with this client in regards to trauma behaviors, and how would you approach the situation to make the client feel safe? Are you thinking that you want to offer the client a tissue? If you want to say to the client, oh, don't cry. Some of those things may feel like impulse or the first thing we think about, but it's really important not to interrupt the client or ask them to stop crying. Now, we're not saying that you want the client to go on and have a class A meltdown in your office. However, you want to create a situation and approach in a way to make the client feel safe. So perhaps you can, take a moment and, just again, tell the client, I'm so sorry. Let's see what we can do to help you. Would you like to take a moment? You want to ask permission always when you're interacting with clients. Would you like to take a moment to take a few deep breaths? It's called like a grounding technique. And again, that could just be, just take a moment, just take a couple of deep breaths, and that can help to calm them down. And then, you can process what they're telling you, because we want to look at safety. And it's important because the client said that they're being threatened. Perhaps your office has a safety plan. So you want to look at what can you provide to the client to make sure that you're creating a safe environment for the client. So you're attending to their emotional responses, you're attending to the safety issues of the client, and you're figuring out a way to connect the client to resources that are going to help them heal. And what does that look like for them? So sometimes we take it upon ourselves to come up with a plan, but if it's not client-centered and client-informed, then it's not a plan that's going to work for the client, because they're not going to follow through with it. So you have to ask them, what do you want as an outcome for this? What do you want to do? Because we often see, particularly in inter-partner violence relationships, we see, parents that go back, into the relationship. And sometimes we want to judge that. But again, that's past trauma coming back and impacting their decision making and their behaviors. And maybe that's what feels safe for them. But when we see a situation like this where the children were being abused and clearly the partner is not, arrested for this situation. So you want to figure out how can you create a safe environment for your client, and then also attend to the emotional needs of the client at the same time, and empower the client to collaboratively work on a solution with you, and offer options to them and choices to move forward. So becoming trauma informed, again, you want to make sure that the area that you have is trauma informed and designed in a way that's going to be welcoming to clients and not trigger them. That the intake process is explained to each client, and they kind of, maybe it'll help them to receive a tour of the facilities that you're going to be interviewing in. That all options, again, being transparent, that they're explained to the client, and that you're including their input in the services that they're going to be receiving. And so that all staff that they interact with are going to understand, everything through a trauma lens, and engage clients through a trauma-informed lens. Language is very important. I will say that. It's really important that we use affirming, trauma-informed, trauma-sensitive language, and we're not using language that is ever judgmental or indicating that we already thinking about, this is what we're going to do because that's the only option. Maybe there's a situation where that there is only one option for them, but that needs to be explained to them. So if there's no other option, say, based on your case, this is what seems to be the only thing that we can do. We'll continue to look for other avenues, but this is what's available for us to work on. And then let them make the decision to decide to do that, because the other choice is to do nothing at all. And that's always a choice that they're going to make. And then we can't, again, put those choices on our clients. So most important, relationship with survivors is part of the context of change and healing from the first interaction. So as I said, every level of the agency should be trauma informed to provide the best approach and outcomes for our clients. So as service providers, we're part of their world, and we'll enter to either reinforce their sense of danger and trigger them, or provide a new experience to reframe trauma experiences and override these defense mechanisms that result from trauma. You want to provide those safe environments and model safety, acceptance, understanding, respect, empowerment for your clients. Remember, your capacity for compassion and empathy is the most valuable tool you have to build positive connections with your clients. Remember, you don't have to be an expert, but it's critical, for you to have kindness and understanding when we're interacting with our clients to help to build their resiliency and better outcomes for them. So John Steinbeck said, you can only understand people if you feel them in yourself. So you always want to put yourself in the place of your clients and understand that whatever you would want for your family, for your colleagues, if it is at all possible, you want to provide the best care you can and legal representation for your clients that you would want for anyone that you actually care about. Okay. So think about ways that you may intentionally or unintentionally trigger your clients, and jot those down and think about, how can I respond to them in an empathetic manner? How can I not say at least, and maybe say, you know what, I understand. And not necessarily I understand either, because you didn't experience their trauma, but say that must be hard. You could say things like that, because I think that people come in and they feel uncomfortable and they want to feel the space. Sometimes silence is hard when we're dealing with clients, but you want to sometimes let that space be, because sometimes clients just need a moment to process, and they may take them a little bit longer to process what you're saying, but you want to be able to actively listen to what they're saying and kind of have them repeat back to you, so you ensure that they're understanding what you're asking them or what you're explaining to them. So again, focus on your empathy and you ensure that emotional and physical safety is being met, for your clients. You want to build capacity and resiliency, know how to turn feelings, for the clients, to work mode when they're on duty and off duty. So if you are having, triggers or countertransference with your clients, you want to be able to kind of put those in check and compartmentalize those for yourself, and then deal with the secondary trauma separate and apart from when you're interacting with your clients. And you also always want to have kind of like practice your game face, right? Because you don't want to say, like, oh my gosh, and they see your emotional response to their story. And that could be also very triggering for them. It's important to engage with cultural humility and empowerment. I cannot stress this enough. We are not the experts of our clients' lives or their experiences, even if we're the same ethnicity or the same culture as our clients. Every single individual's experience is unique. So we need to let them lead us down the journey that's going to help them to a path of healing, but also a path of resiliency. And we will have better legal outcomes for our clients and better case outcomes for them if we simply lead with this humility and empowerment. And again, using a collaborative approach. And remember to breathe. This can be all very overwhelming dealing with trauma survivors. So we have to remember to take a moment, just take a minute to feel it and take a moment and breathe. So I'm going to have a whole nother training on secondary trauma and self-care. But even if you have a very complex client, a complex case, just take a few belly breaths before starting this difficult task. And it's something that, again, you can also model, for your clients as well. So here are my contact details. Again, my name is Dr. Ramona Marchand with Trauma Informed LA. I left my phone number there. And if you have any questions about this particular training, you can email me at rashawn@usc.edu. And then I will give you some contacts for our websites for Trauma Informed LA. So thank you so much.